Kwe, everybody. Good evening. It's great to see such a full house. My name is Andrea Schwenke-Weil, and I'm in the English department, English and Theatre department at Acadia University, and the person who organizes Authors at Acadia. Before we get going for this evening, there are a number of thanks that I would like to give. First of all, I would like to express my thanks and gratitude to Gord Hill, who is our guest of honor for the evening, for coming all the way across the country to talk to us, and also to his partner and his daughter, who have graciously let him come all the way across the country to join us. I would also really like to thank Lauren Sweet from the Sustainability Week organizing. I'm not even sure what her complete title is, but it was her job to organize this project, to have a whole week of events, and particularly tonight's event with Stephen Thomas. And I would also like to thank Stephen Thomas, who's working, the energy coordinator at the Ecology Action Center, who graciously stepped aside so that everyone would come to this talk, and then stepped back into the picture when he agreed to host the evening. So I will be stepping out of the way in a moment. So I would like to thank all the people who have made it possible for us to all be in this one place. It's really great to have such a variety of people. Maybe not all of you would have come originally to this talk, so it's great to have you here. I would also like to acknowledge that we are on unceded Mi'kmaq territory, and going a step further than that, it seems to me that making that acknowledgement isn't really enough. And I've just come back from the Peace and Friendship Treaty Days conference at UNB, where we got to hear a terrific paper by Marilyn Poitras, who talked about what it would be like if we thought about the treaties from an Indigenous perspective. And she told us that, you really wouldn't be starting from the date. So I could quote you the dates of these peace and friendship treaties and point out what this all means, but she took us on a very long journey back and back and back to say all the stuff, all the many things that one needed to think about before one even got to that treaty. And that is all part of the treaty. And so those are some of the things that we really need to learn, and that's why it makes me so happy to have so many of you in the room, so we can maybe get going on that question. And another phrase that I learned while at the conference was teluakan, which means, what are you doing? And that came from someone's presentation, which meant that he was supposed to tell us what he was going to present on, but I took it away as a question that we should all be asking ourselves. What am I doing about this question of addressing the TRC recommendations? What is Acadia doing? What am I doing as an individual student or professor or faculty member or staff member or just person living in this country, which has a history that is very fraught? So that is why you all have an index card, because on this index card I'm hoping you have a pen, and you might write down some action that you think you feel you could take, or you would like to see other people take, or institutions take, or any kind of things. You could write those down, and if you don't have a pen, then maybe you'll have to borrow one from your neighbor, and that will also be good. And I'm also hoping that there are perhaps some code students in the audience, and if it seems like there's time at the end of this evening that we could bring those cards together and have a bit of a conversation about what is on those cards, that would be really great. And we'll do that. And if not, then I will collect the cards and we'll find some other place to have that conversation. So finally, I would like to also make a couple of announcements. One is that at the back, our fabulous independent bookstore, the Box of Delights, has brought a splendid array of Indigenous books. So thanks to Gord, too, for saying, yes, don't only bring my books, bring many books. So I encourage you to have a look at those books. I encourage you to buy some of those books and take them home with you and read them, and then let's have conversations, and then not just have conversations, but engage in some actions. I also would like to announce that Buffy St. Marie is giving a concert here on November 5th, which I think many of you will know about. because that has been advertised. But on Tuesday, November 7th, she's also giving a lecture. That's a free lecture, open to everybody. It's also in Louie Hall at 7:30 on Tuesday, November 7th. And the title of her talk is Detoxifying Aboriginal Self-Perception and Outward Identity. And in that talk, she's going to talk about pressing issues not only in North America, but around the world in Indigenous communities, focusing particularly on the importance of education, activism, so it's a really good follow-up on tonight's talk, health and personal development. So that is the end of my announcements, and now I would like to welcome Stephen Thomas, who is going to give us the intro to Gord Hill.
Two microphones here working. Thank you, and thanks everyone for coming out, of course. My name is Stephen Thomas. I'm the Energy Campaign Coordinator at the Ecology Action Center. I was speaking with Alan Warner and Jonathan's classes this afternoon and had some, I think, really important and powerful conversation. I think also it's important to acknowledge our presence right now on unceded, unsurrendered Mi'kmaq territory, but really in all the work that we do here in Mi'kma'ki, and in all the work and actions we're talking about. I really like the frame of what are you doing, and how we can think about that in a decolonized way too. So we had some conversations about that, and some conversations about climate justice, about the Energy East pipeline and how all that went down, about Alton gas here in the province, and about the looming threat of things like LNG here on the East Coast. I think having those conversations in a different way is a good thing. So I was really stoked, really excited to see Gord speaking tonight. And I think that all the folks who are having those conversations about those infrastructure fights, about climate justice, about fighting fossil fuel infrastructure, and also building this new way of doing things, building this new economy, building this new way of being with one another. I think all those folks having those conversations can learn an awful lot from the conversation tonight. So I'm really excited to hear Gord speak, and without too much further introduction, Gord Hill is an Indigenous writer, artist, activist of the Chakwakawaku Nation. He is an author and illustrator of 500 Years of Indigenous Resistance comic book and the Anti-Capitalist Resistance comic book. Both, I think, are up at the back, as well as the 500 Years of Indigenous Resistance book itself. So those are published both through AK Press and Arsenal Pulp Press. His art and writings have been published in numerous periodicals, including Canadian Dimension, Red Wire, Red Rising Magazine, The Dominion, Recherche, Amindien au Québec, Seattle Weekly, and Broken Pencil. There's lots of material to talk about, so I'm excited just to get to that. So please help me in welcoming Gord Hill.
Does this thing work?
That one is for the video.
Okay, this one's for...
That one's for the audience.
Hello? Can you hear me? Hello? Is that working? Anyway, my name's Gord Hill, and tonight I'm going to talk about art and resistance and its role in maintaining traditional histories and contemporary struggles. First, I'd like to acknowledge we're on Mi'kmaq territory. So I spoke yesterday in Fredericton at the Treaty Conference, and I have a little slideshow to present. Hopefully I won't go too long. So to start with, this is where my people's territory is. It's on northern Vancouver Island on the west coast of British Columbia. And so there's a lot of different Indigenous nations on the west coast. There's like 40-something different Indigenous nations with different languages and whatnot. We have a similar kind of culture all along the coast from Alaska down to Northern California. And the main thing that unifies our culture is the red cedar tree, which provided a lot of materials for us for our building houses and canoes and ceremonial objects such as masks and everyday objects such as boxes and bowls and stuff like that. So this is an example of a house. We call them a big house. It's kind of like a long house. And this one's in Alert Bay where most of my family lives, which is it's a small island on the northern part of Vancouver Island. And with a lot of our objects that we have for everyday use, including this big house, the family crests were painted or carved onto these objects, and this is one important way that we maintained our history and social organization. So we have an oral history, but on the Northwest Coast, this art was very important in maintaining the history as well. So each family has different crests that came from their ancestors. So on this big house is a sea monster crest that comes from the Scow family, which is my family. And it would tell a story of how one of our ancestors had an encounter with a sea monster. And these crests, they helped maintain the social organization because they would be linked to a certain geographical area. And so that was how our family had rights to this territory and the resources on it. So this is inside the big house, and these are house posts that maintain the overall structure. And on the top is a beam with a double-headed sea serpent. It's called a sisioth. And that would also belong to the family. And it would tell a story of how one of the ancestors had encountered a sisioth, which is like a supernatural being. And so with our carving and our paintings and this artwork, we were able to manifest the supernatural beings into a physical object that could be seen in our daily lives. And these the posts on either side, there's a Thunderbird and a Zunaqua. And again, these would be crests of the family, and they would tell stories of our ancestors and how we came to acquire rights to territory. And we would have winter ceremonials. You might be familiar with the term potlatch, which was like a redistribution of wealth that would occur in the wintertime. And so in the big house, this is where our ceremonies would occur. And this is one of the dances from a hamatsa. And this is this bird. It's like a man-eating bird. They're often called the crooked beaks. So this would also tell a story of an ancestor who had gone out and encountered a supernatural being that's, we call it a cannibal spirit. And so each family would have a variation of this story and the area where it occurred. So that would, again, affirm how our family had rights to that territory and the resources on it. And these would be displayed in the big house during a potlatch. And so all the people that were in the big house would be witnesses to this. So this is how we reaffirmed our rights and our obligations and whatnot to our territories. And all the people in the big house who witnessed it would be given gifts, which was part of the redistribution of the wealth. And they'd be given gifts as a payment almost for witnessing this display of rights and crests. So this is another example of a big house, the front of a big house. This is a Thunderbird and a whale. And this is actually a reproduction of a big house from the 1800s. And this is the Umista Cultural Center in Alert Bay, which is kind of functions as a little museum. And Umista means like the return of a treasure, maybe. And the Umista was established, I think, in the early 80s. And it was after many years of effort by Kwakwaka'wakw people to get a lot of the artifacts that were taken by anthropologists or government officials, because there was a potlatch ban through the Indian Act where they banned the potlatch. So this was a long effort by people to get masks and other regalia returned to the community, and so they have it on display in this museum. And this is a still photograph from a movie made by Edward S. Curtis in the 1920s, I think. It was originally called In the Land of the Headhunters, and I think they renamed it to In the Land of the War Canoes. And this would be like a display of a family's crests that they have, and there's a wide variety of supernatural beings and animals that are on display here. And this is a Thunderbird Mask. It's a more contemporary, modern version. These are some canoes from that movie, In the Land of the War Canoes. These are the canoes, I guess. So this is another example of how crests are displayed, and these are on canoes. This is a totem pole in Fort Rupert, which is another Kwakwaka'wakw community. It's like a supernatural bird and a killer whale, and this is another big house that they've built. So for a long time, Alert Bay was the only community that had a big house, and it was a really important cultural center for the Kwakwaka'wakw. But nowadays, a lot of other communities have built big houses, and they have potlatches in their own communities. This is a cedar box. It's a bent wood box. It's made out of one piece of wood that's bent, and then connected on the one corner, with spruce root or whatever. It's tied together. And so this is, it looks like a bear. So these are just another example of how everyday objects would have these crest figures put on them. So this is a Gibson Warrior. On the northern part of the coast, a lot of the indigenous peoples developed some kind of body armor. So this is a helmet with wooden body armor. And again, it's just displaying this example would be displaying the clan crests of this individual. And these are some fighting knives from the Tlingit. On the right-hand side is a knife with a bear, and on the left-hand side, I'm not sure what that represents. This is a Tlingit War Helmet. This is a Nuchanolth, I don't know what you call it, it's like basket making, weaving. It depicts a whale hunt, which was a really important part of the Nuchanolth culture. And this is a painting I did. It's Raven stealing the sun, Raven stealing the light, which is a really common story along the northwest coast, because Raven is our most important kind of cultural hero who brought a lot of benefits to the people. And in this story, the world is in darkness, and Raven knows that the sun is being held by the chief of the sky world, and he keeps it in a little cedar box. So Raven finds a way to get up to the sky world through a hole in the sky, and he transforms himself into like a little pine needle or a hemlock bough or something like that. And because he knows the chief's daughter goes down to this river every day to drink water, so he transforms himself into this little needle, and she swallows it when she's drinking the water. And within a few days she's pregnant and gives birth to Raven as a little child. And in a lot of stories, when this kind of thing happens, the child grows really quickly. So in 4 days, he's like, he's a few years old, kind of. And he becomes the favorite of the sky chief, the chief of the sky world. But he starts throwing tantrums because he wants the chief of the sky world to open the box with the sun in it. So finally, after many days of crying and throwing tantrums, the chief of the sky world opens up the box, and the sun comes out, and Raven steals the sun and comes back to this world where he releases it, and that's why we have the sun. And in other stories, he also takes the moon and the stars. And the thing about Raven is, like, he's our cultural hero, but he's like a trickster figure, because a lot of the things he does, he tries to, he's always kind of like got a self-interest, like he's trying to steal stuff for himself or whatever, but he kind of bungles it up, and it ends up being a beneficial thing for the world. So he's kind of like an anti-hero kind of figure. And this is, so moving on from my own people's culture, this is another example of how art is used to maintain history. And this is a wampum belt, which is really common all along the East Coast and around the Great Lakes region. And the wampum belt was used for, if a treaty was made between indigenous nations, or if there was a military campaign that was being organized, a wampum belt would be passed around to ask other villages or indigenous nations to join in this military campaign. So that's a wampum belt. And this is, I think, a buffalo or maybe a bear robe from the plains, Dakota. And this is it's called a winter count, and how they would record a history. So every winter, whoever had this robe would draw something really significant from that year that happened. Like maybe somebody died or there was a battle or something like that. And so that was an example of how they would maintain a historical record through these pictures. And this is called ledger art, which is also from the plains, and it arose from the trading forts that were established, and they would have these ledger books to keep track of all the goods and commodities that they were selling and whatnot. And so Native people would, get some ledger pages or whatever, and they would draw historical events. So in this example, I think, is from the Battle of the Little Bighorn, where Custer and the 7th Cavalry were defeated. And this is another example of ledger art, and I believe it's Crazy Horse, some incident that happened in his life. And this is, this is more contemporary now. This is Louie Hall, who is a Mohawk. Has anybody heard of Louie Hall? So Louie Hall is a writer and an artist, and he was most active in the early 70s through the 80s. And he was really into promoting a warrior culture and fighting spirit among the Mohawk and among Indigenous people in general. So he wrote the Warrior's Handbook, which was kind of a brief introduction to his philosophy of how, Indigenous peoples need to have warrior societies to defend their territories. And on the right is an early example of the warrior flag that he designed. He passed away in the early 1990s, shortly after the Oka crisis. So the Oka crisis was when we really got to see the warrior flag and to see how the Mohawks had organized this type of resistance, because they've been doing it since the early 1970s. And on the left, of course, is an armed warrior with the warrior flag. On the right is an example of a poster. It was made by David Neal, who's a Kwakwaka'wakw artist. And it's called Life on the 18th Hole, because one of the main instigators of the Oka crisis was that the town of Oka wanted to expand a golf course and also build a condominium project. So this is the most commonly seen or known version of the warrior flag. It's also called the unity flag. And Louie Hall's concept of this was that the single feather was to represent the unification, the unity of purpose, to have one mind for Indigenous people. So that's why it's called the unity flag as well. With a lot of my artwork, when I'm addressing contemporary struggles and trying to create a historical image, I often use what are called iconic images, which are kind of like images that are really well known but that capture the essence of a conflict, let's say. So in this example, it's the photograph of the warrior facing off against the Canadian soldier. So I did a painting, and it was part of a 25-year anniversary thing I did for the Oka crisis. So the Oka crisis was a really important historical event in Canada for Indigenous peoples, and it was kind of like a reawakening of this warrior spirit among our people, and it had a really big impact on Canada, and it really set the tone for Indigenous resistance all through the 90s and even up until today. And if I get this thing running, I can show you some examples of how this manifests itself today. So these are some images just showing how widespread this warrior flag has become, and it kind of highlights the importance of art in creating and maintaining a culture of resistance, not just a history, but a culture of resistance. So on the upper left is a photograph from Elsie Pugtug from 2013, when the Mi'kmaq were fighting against the fracking exploration activities that were happening. And on the lower right is from Hawaii, where Indigenous peoples, this is from like last year or something, where Indigenous peoples were opposing some giant telescope that they wanted to build on some sacred site in Hawaii. It had some really silly name, like the Big Telescope or something like that. And this is a photograph from the Zapatistas in Chiapas, and just shows how Louie Hall's vision of this unity among Indigenous peoples is kind of being, it's still expanding, it's still creating, it's still being built upon with this warrior flag. And this is another version of the warrior flag. There's a few different versions of it. This one has a woman. And this is from the resistance against the Dakota Access Pipeline in North Dakota from last year. And they've seized this bulldozer machinery as part of their direct action to stop construction. Although ultimately they were, they weren't successful. They were defeated and the pipeline was built. But of course it was a very important struggle because thousands of people went to North Dakota to take part in this resistance. And I'm sure a lot of Indigenous people went there and were basically radicalized by their participation in this campaign. And this is an example of a banner. Banners are very important because they also communicate a message. And this one's from Australia. It says fighting terrorism since 1788, which was when I think Cook maybe arrived in Australia. And this is a banner I did for 500 years of Indigenous resistance. And I've used that double-headed sea serpent, the Sisi with a Mexica symbol, the Quetzalcoatl, which is a feathered serpent. And I found a double-headed version of it. So I thought it was kind of neat to combine the two, or North and South America. Okay, these are billboards. So this is from Ganyonge territory, which is in New York State, which was established in the 1970s when Mohawks from Ganawagi, Ganawagi is kind of a small reserve just outside Montreal, but it's a small reserve, but it's got a large population. So there was a movement on the reserve to go out and reoccupy some of their traditional territory in order to provide living space. And so in 1974, they carried out an armed occupation in New York State, and they had a standoff with the state police and whatnot. And after a few years of negotiations, they eventually negotiated a settlement, and they got a piece of land which they still live on today. And it's like a sovereign territory where police aren't able to access it. And they really tried to build up a self-sufficient economy, trying to grow, growing food and that type of stuff. And I think they might have got into bingo and stuff like that as well. But the Mohawks have been really at the forefront of building a self-sufficient economy of some kind, with different things like tobacco sales and stuff like that, which is one of their traditional crops. And this is another billboard. This is from Alert Bay, and Alert Bay is a Kwakwaka'wakw community, but the Kwakwaka'wakw Nation is made up of maybe 20 different villages, and each village has its own name. And this, in Alert Bay, they're the Numgeese, and the Numgeese were anglicized into the Nimkish. So the billboard says Nimkish land, and it points one direction because that's where the reserve was on Alert Bay. And the other half of the island was kind of called the White End, and it was where the non-native people lived. And so there's one arrow saying Nimkish land is that way, and stolen land is the other way. And that's also a sea monster. And that's my brother Fa, who's got his hand leaning on the billboard. Kind of tired, so get emotional and tired. This is some graffiti from Ganawagi, and it's kind of it's celebrating or honoring this tradition that the Mohawks developed with ironwork. Because a lot of them got into ironwork. They built a lot of the skyscrapers in New York City, for example, and so I just thought that was an interesting graffiti. I think it's on the Mercier Bridge, which connects into Montreal, which was seized during the Oka crisis. It's like a vital commuter link into Montreal. And so this is a mural from Unasitin, which is a Wet'suwet'en camp in northern BC. And they built this camp about 5 years ago to stop a proposed pipeline, a natural gas pipeline called Pacific Trails Pipeline. But it also had the same route as the proposed Enbridge Northern Gateway Pipeline, which was defeated and canceled a year and a half ago or something. But they still have this camp established. They live in this camp, and they built a lot of structures there. I wish I had a picture of their healing center, which is like a 3-story building out in the middle of the wilderness. It's like 70 kilometers down a logging road off of the highway into this area where they established this camp. And they have a lot of structures there to house a lot of people if they need to bring in people if the police or whatever are trying to do some kind of action. And there's quite a few camps like this in British Columbia. There's Matty Lee, which is a Gitxsan camp, which was set up to stop a natural gas pipeline. There was a reoccupation camp on Lilu Island by the Tsimshian to stop Petronas, which was a Malaysian company that wanted to build a massive LNG processing facility that would endanger a salmon habitat, where salmon lay their eggs or something like that. A really important salmon area. So that was defeated, and Petronas canceled that project as well. There was another camp called Shudikath, which was established in 2001 to stop a proposed ski resort in the Statlium territory, and that's kind of down there in Whistler, which is a major international ski resort. So in the early 2000s, there was this big push to build a lot of ski resorts in the province. But the Statlium were successful, and they stopped this proposed ski resort, and they still maintain this camp as well. So there's a lot of these camps that people have set up, and the government and the police are very hesitant to remove these camps because of the potential conflict that it could create. So these are some murals in East Vancouver. These ones are by Corey Bullpit, who is a Haida artist. And these murals are part of a campaign that the city kind of started in the mid-90s to stop political graffiti that was happening in East Vancouver. First, they passed a bylaw that any business that had graffiti painted on the side of its building had to paint it over within 2 days, or they'd have a $2,000 fine. So what ended up happening was a lot of buildings, they just got like the cheapest paint, which is gray, I guess. So they would paint up to about 7 or 8 feet. They'd constantly painting over this graffiti. So a lot of buildings just had this two-tone kind of thing, whatever the original color of the building was, and then this gray piece. So then the police and the business improvement associations got together, and they started this mural campaign, this mural thing, where artists were paid to paint these murals, and this would stop graffiti from happening. So in my mind, it's kind of like a mixed thing. You have pros and cons of it. The cons, of course, is that they're suppressing this political graffiti, this political expressions with these murals. But on the other hand, with these native murals, I see it as kind of a positive thing because a lot of Indigenous people in the city, they're often quite disconnected from traditional culture. But I think these murals can kind of help reconnect them, or to instill a sense of pride in their culture. And so on the left is a sea bear, which is in an alleyway off of Commercial Drive in Vancouver. And on the right is ravens stealing the sun. I'm not quite sure where that mural is. This is another example of a mural in the downtown east side of Vancouver, and this is on like a 4 or 5 story building. I think it's called Through the Eyes of Raven. I think it's just kind of neat to see, because obviously no one would do graffiti on the side of the building this big, right? But it's just kind of inspiring to see for me. The downtown east side is like a big ghetto in the city. It's like one of the poorest postal codes in Canada. So it's good to see this Indigenous art manifesting itself in the urban areas. So these are some posters. Protect the Sacred Oak Flats is an Apache campaign to stop some kind of mining thing or something happening in one of their traditional territory called Oak Flats. And on the right is another variation of the warrior flag, Keep Calm and Warrior On, made by a Mohawk artist from Awaji. And this one depicts a man and a woman, kind of warrior. This is a graphic I did. It was kind of a generic graphic against resource exploitation or resource destruction. It's got a bear, a wolf, and a salmon. And it became, a lot of people liked it for the anti-pipeline struggles, so groups started using it for posters, for events, for t-shirts, and just kind of on their websites and stuff like that. And this is a painted version I did of the same graphic. This is another graphic I did of an eagle grabbing a snake, which is kind of like a common image that I just kind of tweaked a little bit and made the snake into a pipeline. The snake's been getting a bad rap with this pipeline business because everyone's drawing the pipelines as a snake. But this is a mural. I'm not sure where it is. Might be in Rapid City, South Dakota. I'm not too sure. But it's obviously a mural against the Dakota Access Pipeline. And this artist has combined a few different Indigenous cultural art forms to make this mural. And again, you can see the snake. And this is an example of a modern day ledger art. And Morton County was the county where most of the resistance against the Dakota Access Pipeline was occurring in. So this represents the sheriffs coming in and doing their acts of repression against the people there. This is another example of a ledger art. Again, it's an anti-pipeline, the Dakota Access Pipeline graphic with a bunch of warriors trying to kill this snake pipeline. This is a comic I did for the Seattle Weekly. This is the Kinder Morgan. Kinder Morgan is proposed to expand their Trans Mountain pipeline, which is running from the tar sands in northern Alberta to a port just adjacent to Vancouver. So there's been a lot of opposition to this pipeline, kind of evolving from the campaign against the Enbridge Northern Gateway pipeline, which created a lot of opposition from both Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people, because a lot of people were really concerned about the pipeline. Well, first it started with the tar sands. Like in 2007 or so, a campaign really started against the tar sands in northern Alberta. And this kind of tied into the proposed Enbridge pipeline, which was going to cross through Alberta to the coast near Prince Rupert on the northern coast of BC. So a lot of people are concerned about the pipeline crossing through large tracts of land and crossing a lot of rivers and other bodies of water. And then once it got to the coast, there was these massive super tankers were going to take this oil mostly to foreign markets in Asia. And so a lot of opposition arose against this proposal. Because on the coast we had the experience of the Exxon Valdez oil tanker crashing, and I think in 1987, late 1980s, the oil tanker ran aground and spilled a lot of oil, and it still has an effect today in northern BC. So that's in people's minds. And then there was the BP oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico a few years ago, which, it just seemed to go on for months. This oil rig that exploded and was just spewing oil, and that really scared people on the west coast of BC too. So these factors kind of contributed to this massive popular opposition to the Enbridge Gateway pipeline. And that was why that pipeline was defeated. And now today the Kinder Morgan pipeline is a very similar thing. The pipeline was built in the 1950s, and they want to expand it and then basically double the capacity of this pipeline, and there would be a massive increase in oil tankers going from Vancouver out into the open ocean. So again, it's created a very large oppositional movement to it. So this is a comic I did for the Seattle Weekly. This is a Hailtic graphic against the Enbridge Northern Gateway pipeline, and it depicts basically like a warrior, but there's also, the main figure is a sea monster, and in its mouth is one of those oil tankers. So that was one of their graphics they used during their organizing against the pipeline, proposed pipeline. This is art by Art Wilson, who's a Gitxsan artist, and these images are from a book that he had published in the mid-1990s. It's called The Heartbeat of the Earth. And this book kind of influenced me in my artwork because he was taking traditional art forms from the Northwest Coast, but using them to address contemporary issues and contemporary struggles. Because the Gitsan were carrying out a lot of blockades in the mid or to late 1980s against logging. That was their big issue. And also fisheries struggles, fishing rights, which is what the bottom right-hand corner one represents, is an incident they had with the Department of Fisheries and Oceans. So that had a big influence on me. It kind of inspired me to use the traditional art forms for contemporary struggles and building that, culture of resistance as well. And the Gitsan and the Wet'suwet'en were the ones who launched the Delgamuuk land title action. I don't know if you heard of Delgamuuk. Anybody heard of Delgamuuk? Yeah, it was like a precedent-setting Aboriginal title case that, it was a court case that accepted oral histories as evidence. It had a big impact anyway. Okay, this is my comic book that I did, I think in 2011 it was published. And the way the comic started was I was doing short comics, like 6 or 7 page comics about different struggles that had happened that I thought were really important, that I wanted to put in a format that could be distributed at conferences or powwows or wherever Indigenous people were gathering. And it would be easy to reproduce. It was black and white comics, and if I could just get access to a photocopier, I could print out copies and go and distribute them. So after a while, I had a collection of these. I did a few different stories, and then someone suggested I should do 500 Years of Indigenous Resistance. So I kind of started working on that, and then a friend of mine took it down to Arsenal Pulp Press, and they wanted to publish it, which was surprising to me. So that was awesome. I said, yeah, that'd be great. So the basic concept of the comic became, when I really started working on it, was to document Indigenous resistance that would inspire Indigenous people. Because through the colonial history kind of presents this story of the colonization of the Americas, that Indigenous peoples were just kind of squashed, crushed by the super powerful European culture and technology, just kind of steamrolled over Indigenous peoples and wiped them out, and that was kind of the end of it. But if you actually look into the history, there was a lot of resistance that went on for a very long time. Like some areas were never conquered, some areas it took hundreds of years for the European colonial forces to actually subjugate them, to gain control of territory. So these stories I thought were very inspiring, but that it was important to maintain this history and to make it accessible to Indigenous people. And I think that I like the comic book format because I think a lot of people have a hard time reading heavy-duty historical texts. It's hard to get through it, especially if you're working or you got a really stressful life or something. And also young people who might have a hard time reading these types of texts. The comic book is pretty accessible to a wide range of people. So that's kind of what I wanted to do. So the cover represents a Tlingit attack on a Russian fort at Sitka in 1802, where they destroyed the Russian fort. And the Tlingit are an inspiring story as well, because they were never conquered by the Russians or any other European groups that were operating on the Northwest Coast. And they were a very strong warrior people who acquired a lot of firearms, and that's how they were able to fight against all other, these competing Europeans that were coming in to trade. So I wanted to use that for the cover because it kind of conveys this is what this book is going to, this is what this book is about. So this is the first page of the comic book, and it starts with Christopher Columbus' initial invasion of the Americas, where he kind of comes over and conducts a reconnaissance mission with the 3 ships, the Pinta, the Nina, and the Santa Maria. Goes into the Caribbean region, And it's over the last, since 1992, there was a big campaign at that time to kind of expose Columbus, because he was always celebrated as this discoverer of the Americas and whatnot. But again, if you actually look into the history of Columbus and what he did, it's acts of genocide. He's beginning this colonial invasion of the Americas. So in terms of Indigenous resistance to colonialism, this was the most logical place to start, because this is the first European colonial force that came over and began this invasion. This is a story about the Mapuche, which is another really inspiring story, because they were never conquered by the Spanish, who they had to deal with in current day Chile and Argentina. The Mapuche are another strong warrior people. They're a very decentralized, kind of autonomous, non-hierarchical culture, and that was why they were able to resist so long. When you compare it to other indigenous cultures such as the Mexica, also known as the Aztec, who had a much more authoritarian structure. So once the Spanish got to the Mexica territory, they were able to basically take control of it very quickly, because the Mexica were this big kind of civilization that had kind of gone out and kind of conquered a lot of the tribal nations around them. So the Spanish was just a couple hundred soldiers, were able to rally a lot of these other indigenous groups to go and attack the Mexica. And the Mexica fell fairly quickly because of their authoritarian structure, because they just kind of decapitated the ruling class, and the whole system kind of fell apart. And then, of course, there was the disease epidemics that were occurring. But it's just an example of how different kind of social organizations contribute to how successful a resistance can be. Because you think the Mexica, there's like 20 million Mexica. Like, you think they're going to be a formidable force, but they fell fairly quickly compared to the Mapuche, who fought for like 3 centuries or something like that. So this section I did, War on the Coast. It's about the Northwest Coast, the colonization on the Northwest Coast. On the Northwest Coast, the colonial history is basically that European traders came, they engaged in the fur trade. The natives were really shrewd, and they really benefited from this fur trade. And then there was unfortunate disease epidemics that wiped out up to 90% of the population. And that's kind of the narrative of colonization in BC on the coast. But again, if you look at the history, there was actually a lot of conflict, because what happened was you had these really heavily armed trading vessels going into the area and often trying to force trade conditions on Indigenous people. So there were a lot of attacks on these vessels, these big ships, especially among the Nucha-Noth, who attacked a lot of vessels. There's a very famous story. John Jewett was one of the, he was an armorer on the ship, and the armorer is the one who repairs the weapons and stuff. But anyway, this ship had gone into the Nucha-Noth area and had, tried to carry out some kind of, aggressive action to enforce trade condition on the Nucha-Noth, and they'd humiliated the chief of the area and stuff like this. So anyway, the Nucha-Noth, they attacked the ship. They killed the entire crew except for John Jewett, because they knew he's the armorer. So he was kept for a couple of years. He ended up writing a book. It was called White Slave of the Nootka. The Nootka were what the Nucha-Noth were called at one time by anthropologists. And they always get the names wrong. But so he wrote a book. It was kind of a little famous little historical account of his life among the Nucha-Noth, which apparently is like somewhat exaggerated, which a lot of these guys did. Like, what was the other one? Captain Smith or something. John Smith in the Eastern American colonies. He wrote a little account. He's the one who married Pocahontas, kind of thing. So he had a lot of exaggerations. But anyway, John Jewett was kept for a couple years, and anyway, that was just part of the history of on the Northwest Coast. So we had the trading vessels, attacks on the trading vessels, and then once the BC, or Vancouver Island was made into a colony, and it was governed by the Hudson's Bay Company, and once that happened in around 1849, 1850, the Royal Navy deployed gunboats along the coast. So the gunboats were used to enforce colonial law and order all up and down the coast, and they would go into villages if there was any attacks that occurred on settlers or whatever, the gunboats would go in and demand that the village hand over the suspects, and they would hang them in front of the village. And if the village refused, they would bomb the village with the gunboats. So there was a lot of cases of this, and this is just like kind of erased from the history of colonization in BC. So this was another example of like, I thought this was really important to maintain this history. So that's what that one was about. This one, No Justice on Stolen Land, is in the comic book, and it's a little account of how in BC, most of the land in BC is untreated land. It's still, sovereign Indigenous territory, illegally occupied by the province of BC and the government of Canada. Because in 1763, when the British defeated the French, they had to reorganize the entire colonial system in North America. And at that time, they passed the 1763 Royal Proclamation, which prohibited any trade or settlement past a certain boundary line, which ran along the Appalachian Mountains and kind of set a border along the East Coast. And no settlement or trade could occur on the other side of that, which was considered sovereign Indigenous lands, unless a treaty was made. So that's the basis of the treaty-making system that Canada eventually adopted in the 1800s, and why we have these numbered treaties, for example, like Treaty Number 1, Treaty Number 4, Treaty Number 10, all along the prairies. In BC, they started making treaties on Vancouver Island. They made about a dozen treaties for the surrender of land, and this was around the Hudson's Bay forts on Vancouver Island. But then there was a dispute with England. England didn't want to fund these making of these treaties. The colony of Vancouver Island didn't want to fund it, so they just stopped making treaties. And today there's a modern day BC treaty process, which they're trying to legalize the prior theft of Indigenous land. And I mean, that's a whole other discussion. But in BC, there's a really high consciousness among Indigenous peoples that the land is actually stolen, because there is no treaties, and the British and Canada violated their own laws, which is the 1763 Royal Proclamation, which was reaffirmed in the Constitution Act 1982, I think. So it's still law, and so this is the basis of a lot of Indigenous resistance in the province and a lot of legal challenges in the courts against resource exploitation. And one of the main reasons they started the BC treaty process was after the Oka crisis, because they saw that in BC had the highest amount of solidarity actions with the Mohawks. There was widespread Indigenous solidarity with this armed standoff, and the most solidarity actions, like blockades of highways and railways and stuff, were happening in BC. So within a year or two, they established the BC Treaty Commission to reconcile this problem, this legal problem. And also, another important reason why they're doing this is to create legal certainty for corporations who want to come in and carry out resource exploitation activities. So that's what's going on in BC right now. So like if you heard like Idle No More, you guys heard of that, right? So when Idle No More was starting, it kind of started in the prairies, and they all have the treaties out there, and they're all like, we're all treaty people and stuff like that. But in BC, we're not treaty people. And in fact, most grassroots people in the province, grassroots Indigenous people, are opposed to the modern day treaty process. But again, that's another discussion. So this is the comic about the Oka crisis that I obviously felt was really important. It was one of the first comics I did, just to maintain that history of what happened, and because it was a very inspiring act of resistance that occurred there. Another page from that comic. So Zapatistas, of course, 1994, in Chiapas, the Zapatista Army of National Liberation launched their rebellion on January 1st, 1994, when the North American Free Trade Agreement was coming into effect. And the Zapatistas are interesting because they kind of occurred, in like 1989, 1990, the East Bloc fell. A lot of the left was demoralized. I remember there was a communist bookstore in Vancouver on Commercial Drive, and they had like these walls full of Marx and Lenin and stuff. And after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the East Bloc, they put this big bin, they had this big bin where they dumped all their Marx and Lenin books, and they had like a big sale on them. And they totally revamped their bookstore to be a more broader kind of leftist, radical bookstore. But it was very demoralizing for a lot of people around the world, because here the capitalists are all, celebrating. They're all this triumphant kind of thing happening, and everybody's like, huh. And then all these guerrilla movements that were getting support from the Soviet Union and that, they were kind of collapsing too. And then, kind of like, oh, geez, what's happening? And then 1994, the Zapatistas come out and they take over like 7 towns and cities in Chiapas. And their big thing was neoliberalism, which became the major kind of mobilization thing of the late 1990s was neoliberalism, globalization, this whole free trade thing that was happening. WTO and the World Trade Organization protests in Seattle, 1999. And onward from there. So the Zapatistas had a major impact, very inspiring again. So I thought that's another important story to document and have. This is 1995, a standoff that occurred in central BC, an armed standoff between the Secwepemc and basically the state, the province of British Columbia, which was at the time was the NDP, the New Democratic Party, was the ruling party. So you always think, oh, the NDP, they're progressive, they're kind of leftist, socialistic almost. But they were the ones who sent in this like massive RCMP force, 450 heavily armed police. They're mostly emergency response teams. And they got 8 armored personnel carriers from the Canadian Forces. And they brought in all these sniper rifles and stuff. And it originated from a Sundance camp that the Secwepemc had up near 100 Mile House in central BC. This dispute between the Sundance camp and this American rancher who had his cattle grazing in the area, and the cattle were coming into the Sundance area, so they kind of fenced it off and they were obstructing this cattle grazing activity. So he and his cowboy ranch hands were started harassing the camp and making threats against them. And it was at this time the Sundance camp had the Sundance had ended, and there was an elder and his family living at the camp. So he made a call for warriors to come in and to assist them and to set up a defense for them. So some of the Secwepemc went in and they brought a bunch of guns with them, and it eventually turned into a month-long armed standoff with the RCMP. And what happened with the Chapatan means big lake, because there was a big lake in that area. Chapatan is the Secwepemc name for the area, so that's why it's called Chapatan. But 1995, this standoff occurred, an armed standoff, and at the same time there was the Ipperwash conflict in southern Ontario, where the Ontario Provincial Police went in and they shot and killed Dudley George, which I have that in the comic as well, because that's another important conflict that happened. But this, what the government did with these 2 incidents, Ipperwash and Chapatan, was they sent in a heavily armed police. Because they had done there was an analysis done of the Oka crisis in 1990, and they had concluded, this analysis had concluded that the deployment of the military, because they eventually deployed a mechanized infantry brigade into the Mohawk territories of Ganawagi and Ganasitagi. Ganasitagi is where Oka is. And they had, it was like 4,500 soldiers, and they had sent ships up the St. Lawrence River, and there was tanks and armored personnel carriers. It's a massive deployment, overwhelming force. But they had done an analysis, and they had concluded that the deployment of this overwhelming military force had given the Mohawks a moral victory in the eyes of the public, because this lightly armed Indigenous insurgent movement had stood up against this big military force. So they had, through this thing, they said, well, what we should do in the future is we should just have heavily armed police go in to contain these types of incidents. And also they decided that they had to control the media narrative. And because in Oka, the media were right in with the warriors. And a lot of sympathetic reporting was coming out, and there was a widespread solidarity with the Mohawks, the warriors, even though a police officer was shot and killed. and they're bearing arms, AK-47s and M16s and whatnot. But there was widespread solidarity for them, so they decided we can't allow this to happen again. And so in 1995, when these two other incidents occurred, they had the counterinsurgency strategy was to use heavily armed police as a means of criminalizing the indigenous resistance that was occurring. So anyway, that's what happened. These two conflicts also arose from the Oka crisis. Like these standoffs, these conflicts wouldn't have occurred without Oka, because that's the impact Oka had on indigenous people. Okay, so my comic book was translated into German. A German publishing company translated it, and it's been published in Germany and also in Italy. And a couple years ago, they flew me over to Italy to this radical comic book publishing company sent me in northern Italy. They flew me over to speak at their conference and that. And that was really tiring because I was so jet lagged, and I got there, I was so tired. And I was there for a week. I spoke at 2 conferences, and at the end of the week, I was just recovering from my jet lag, and then I had to fly back. That was kind of hard, but it was good to do, I guess. Yeah, it was good to do. So this is another graphic I've done, Keep Common Warrior on, and that's my website at the bottom. Yeah, you can basically read it, warriorpublications.wordpress.com. And I've been maintaining it since 2007, and it's mostly, I just mostly repost corporate news articles as kind of a historical documentation, because a lot of times I found when I went to find a news article about something, it was really hard to find. It no longer existed, 404, page not found, whatever. So I wanted to just take these articles and put them on this website. And I also repost news from grassroots, independent media, press releases, and every once in a while I'll write my own articles. But since I had my baby daughter, I don't do that really much at all. So, and actually, sleep deprived is like a way of life for me now because of my daughter. So with that, that's the end of my slideshow presentation. So it's 8:05. So if anybody has any questions or comments, we can take those now. And I don't know if there's a microphone they're going to pass around. So anybody got any questions? Yes, right in the back there.
I noticed,
Please don't do a mic drop. Just kidding. Just kidding.
I noticed that in your presentation you talked about Indigenous nations from all around the world. And that just made me think about how we tend to, even though these nations are have a lot of different backgrounds and a lot of different experiences, we tend to lump them together as one identity. So I was wondering if you could speak to how the homogenizing of Indigenous nations affects art and resistance. So the way that non-Indigenous people see Indigenous people as these are Indigenous people, not these are Mi'kmaq, these are different people.
Yeah. Well, I think there's 2 sides to it. I think in some ways people do recognize. I mean, coming from the Northwest Coast, Indigenous art is a big market. So a lot of people recognize that that's Northwest Coast art. I mean, on the Northwest Coast, or when you see Northwest Coast art, the way it's simplified or whatever is that's Haida art. And it's a lot of it's not Haida art, but the Haida have become the flagship of that. So if you look, and then on the plains, if you look at plains art and culture, then that's the Sioux. But of course, there's a lot of other plains Indigenous nations. In the eastern woodlands, I don't know what the example might be there, Ojibwe. That's Ojibwe art, but there's a whole bunch of different Indigenous nations. So I think that's maybe how the homogenization occurs. It's the most prominent, most well-known type of Indigenous culture is always associated with the most well-known kind of tribe or something, which comes from the colonial histories that were taught and how they're so simplified. I think maybe that's kind of That's the best answer I think I can give in my present state of mind. Any other questions?
This image that's up here looks like one of the stormtroopers with a hide or look on it. Can you talk to us about your thoughts on cultural appropriation?
Well, this one is a Tlingit War Helmet, and my family actually is also Tlingit. So it's kind of it's for a Northwest Coast people, this design. I have shirts too. I have t-shirts for sale, and they're $15 each as well. But, so this is kind of a part of my thing, and my website and my artwork is I'm always like promoting, and this is like from Louie Hall's thing too, is like promoting warrior cultures of resistance. Because his thing was like, people without a fighting spirit will lack the will to resist. So his thing was really promoting warrior culture. So I took that too, and I agree with him about it. And so in my artwork, that's what I try to do a lot. So this example is kind of a way of reviving or remembering our warrior culture on the Northwest Coast. So I have the Tlingit War Helmet. Well, I call it a Tlingit War Helmet, but in the northern part of the coast, like a lot of the nations had these types of war helmets, the Tsimshian, the Haida, the Gitsan. They also had this type of war helmet. And then below it is the fighting knife that was also common among the same groups of people, Tsimshian, Haida, and that. And a Neutral North, well, it's called the Neutral North War Club. It's from a whalebone, and that was more common on the southern part of the coast. So that's what this graphic is about. Appropriation of native culture. You asked me to talk about that? I mean, there's a lot of appropriation that goes on, especially in BC, because the Northwest Coast art is used in a lot of things. Like the 2010 Winter Olympics, they used Indigenous art a lot. There was Indigenous artists who collaborated with the Olympic industry in doing artwork for them. And there, like I mentioned earlier, there's a big market for Northwest Coast native art, and that has its pros and cons too. Because in the capitalist system, the culture is commodified, and so that's what a lot of artists, they make carvings of masks and stuff to be sold to a non-native market. And you can have critiques of that, but at the same time, it's an important source of livelihood for a lot of native people. A lot of them do this artwork, and it kind of helped revive the culture, which was, it suffered a lot during the early 1900s in the late 1800s with the disease epidemics, the ban on the potlatches and stuff like that. And so it was kind of revived in a really big way in the 60s and 70s. And part of this big revival was for this commercial market. But it also fed into a revival of cultural ceremonies. So the potlatch system was kind of revived. And a lot of artists, they also produce artwork for the potlatches. So there's kind of pros and cons to it. In an ideal world, there would be no commodification of the art or no capitalist system maybe, but that is the reality of the world we live in. And it's a struggle because you can see now there's a little more consciousness about the co-optation of Indigenous art, but it still occurs. There's a lot of stuff made in China that's Northwest Coast native art now. But some of that now is like native artists are the one who make those designs, and then a company gets them produced in China, and now they're sold in North America or around the world, wherever they sell it. Yeah. Was a question over there? Or were you just stretching? You were stretching. All right. Anybody else got any questions? Yep. Yeah, you. Yeah. Yes, sir. The microphone.
On the topic of commodification of culture, do you have any advice on implementing anti-capitalist ideology in your everyday life? It's something that's so pervasive and hard to avoid as capitalism.
Anti-capitalist ideology in your everyday life? Yeah, that's, DIY, do it yourself instead of buying, always thinking of purchasing items, trading. There's a fairly large trading network among Indigenous peoples where they're not just selling stuff, they're trading items. On the coast, there's a lot of seafoods and stuff like that that's traded with interior peoples for, deer meat or moose meat and whatnot. So there's still these kind of networks that are traditionally based. As a Northwest Coast people, they traveled all up and down the coast, down to Southern California even, on trading, doing a lot of trade. So that's kind of a part of things. The potlatch system is an anti-capitalist kind of social system as well. That's partly why it was banned, because the authorities found that people aren't accumulating wealth, they're redistributing it and destroying it in the potlatch system. So that's why it was banned. And so that happens today. There's a large redistribution of wealth. A family will accumulate thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of dollars sometimes to put into a potlatch, and that's to redistribute, in the winter ceremonials. So, yeah, I mean, it's hard and engaging in self-sufficiency if you can, growing your own food. These reoccupation camps that I described in BC, and there's others across the country, I mean, to me, these are kind of anti-capitalist things as well, because one of the bases of capitalist system is the private property. So they're challenging that. A lot of these camps, I'd say actually all of these camps are on Crown land, which is government-owned land. So that's a challenge, I think, too, to capitalism. Yeah, but it is a difficult thing. You can never really escape from this system. You see, since the 60s, people have been trying, making co-ops and stuff like that. But they're kind of integrated into the capitalist system now. There's alternative markets. Culture is always being commodified. So even these rebellious cultures that emerge are eventually commodified. Hip hop is an example. Punk is another example. The hippies, they got commodified. So, but any other questions? Yep.
How is there an effect from the Longhouse Society? I'm talking about that's the thing. It was a movement for a while, I think, as part of the Warrior thing.
Yeah.
And then I sort of lost track of what happened to it.
The Longhouse. Yeah, the Mohawks, the Haudenosaunee, the Six Nations Iroquois Confederacy, they've done a lot of work over the last few decades in reviving and rebuilding their Longhouse system. Louie Hall was one of the people who really pushed for the revival of the Longhouse and of the Haudenosaunee, the Confederacy. And there's a lot of divisions in their communities because there's different interpretations. The Great Law of Peace is like their constitution. But now there's different interpretations of it. One of the divisions that occurred was with Handsome Lake, who was portrayed as a prophet who kind of revised the Great Law of Peace. And so there's followers of the Handsome Lake Code. There's followers of a more traditional code. And I think in Ganawagi, there's maybe 3 or 4 different longhouses that people are grouped in. And Tyendinaga, which is another Mohawk community, I think there's at least 2 different longhouses. There's one that's really traditional and actually quite radical, and they were conducting a lot of the blockades in Tyendinaga. So there's, they've put a lot of effort into rebuilding their confederacy and their longhouse system, and I can't speak too much more about it though, because I'm not obviously not involved in it. But we don't have that. We have there's clan systems on the coast, and among the Kwakwaka'wakw, it's more just like family lineages. Yeah. Any other questions? Right here.
Thank you so much for your talk, Gord. I know you won't be surprised to get this question from me, but I'm just wondering if you could tell us a little bit about what you're working on now and maybe how it what links you see with the work that you've done already on anti-colonialism and anti-capitalism.
Yeah, right now my publisher is Arsenal Pulp Press. They want me to do an anti-fascist comic book, so that's what I'm working on right now, Antifa comic book. And it's kind of it's basically showing the history of fascism and anti-fascist resistance, starting with the Italian example through Germany and Spain up until the modern day. I mean, it is part of an anti-capitalist resistance overall, because the fascist movements were basically reactionary movements that were mobilized and funded by members of the ruling class to destroy revolutionary movements in Europe. So that's another important part of history that we're all kind of a part of, because we're all kind of assimilated into this capitalist system. I mean, you know, the first peoples colonized by the Europeans were the Europeans, right? By the Romans colonized Western Europe, because all the peoples in Europe were tribal peoples at one time. And that's another comic I thought that might be another cool comic to do, is European tribal resistance against the Romans, because there's a lot of inspiring stories from that as well. But the anti-fascist comic book is, I'm working on it right now, and they would like to have it published maybe in the spring, but I highly doubt that's going to happen. And the other date they have is for the fall of 2018, so that's when it'll be completed. Yeah. They're really pumped about it too. It's going to be a full color comic, and all these fascists have really inspired them.
No, just come out with the American election, which would be good. I mean, an anti-fascist comic might be very useful at that point.
Yeah.
Given the vast array of nations, Indigenous nations in Canada, not to mention those around the world, what would you say is the one or two things that unify the Indigenous movements around the world?
I think it's basically how Indigenous cultures are connected to the land and the natural world. I think that's the most basic commonality, and what Indigenous means. It's the land and the natural world. And you have a lot of diversity within that, but you could always see the commonality, the common traits among Indigenous people wherever they're from, if it's in Asia or South America or Australia or Africa. Yeah. Anybody else? All right, well, I guess that's it. All right, thank you.